Alright, this is a response to an Orthodox layperson, and first off, we must realize that his views do not represent mainstream or orthodox theology, if you will. His views are diametrically opposed to the views of some of the major Eastern Orthodox theologians out there. His theology borders on irrationality, and his grasp of church history is suspect. This is a response to some of the comments he's made in his video, which was supposed to be a response to mine, yet he doesn't touch upon any of the Greek text that I examine in Matthew 16. It's very likely that he has no grasp of the biblical Greek, which is a likely reason as to why he doesn't touch upon it, but it's even likely that this person isn't really an apologist at all. He masquerades as an apologist by cut and pasting arguments from various books. In other words, he's done no real research on any of the fathers that he puts forth, and all he seemingly really does is give his position a black eye in his shoddy presentation. We're going to go into detail, detailing each and every single father that he puts forth, especially his claim that these fathers do not support Peter as having been the rock of Matthew chapter 16. We'll first detail a list of the fathers that he tosses out immediately, and he lists these fathers as not supporting the position that Peter was the rock of Matthew 16. And touching upon Gregory of Nyssa says, "The memory of Peter, the head of the apostles, is celebrated and magnified. Indeed, with him are the other members of the church. But upon him is the church of God firmly established, for he is agreeable to the gift conferred upon him by the Lord, that unbroken and most firm rock upon which the Lord built his church." Cyril of Alexandria, he changed his name into Peter from the word Petra, rock, for on him he was afterwards to found his church. We must be clear in examining what Cyril says, for he tells us that the immovable and stable faith of the disciple is what the church is founded on. This appears in his treatise on the Holy Trinity. Does this then invalidate what he has said about Peter elsewhere? It doesn't. What we can find among certain fathers in identifying a father as having mentioned Peter's faith or his confession as the rock, this is only a further affirmation that it is indeed Peter that is the rock of the church. It is illogical to try and separate Peter, the man, from his very own faith or confession. It was illogical in Latin, and it was illogical and nonsensical in Greek. For in Cyril's very own commentary on Matthew, we read that Christ promises to found the church, assigning immovableness to it, as he is the Lord of strength, and over this he sets Peter as shepherd. John Chrysostom, Peter himself, the head or crown of the apostles, the first in the church, the friend of Christ, who received a revelation not from man but from the Father, as the Lord bears witness to him, saying, "Blessed are you." This very Peter, and when I name Peter, I name that unbroken rock, that firm foundation, the great apostle, the first of the disciples, the first called and the first who obeyed. Did Chrysostom separate Peter's faith or confession from Peter, the man? No. In fact, when identifying the very rock of the church, he says, Peter, that unbroken rock. Theodoret, in reference to Peter, he calls Peter the great foundation of the church. And we hear mention as well of a certain Theophylact, but in attempting to remain true to what this video is about, and it's about Patristics, we'll stick to the early church fathers. Theophylact, as such, is not an early father. Moving onwards, Saint Hilary. In examining Hilary, we can see how some can think that Hilary is labeling the confession only of Peter as a rock. But upon a clear and exegetical analysis of his writings, we read, "Blessed Simon, who after his confession of the mystery was set to be the foundation stone of the church, and received the keys of the kingdom." Notice clearly, after his confession, the confession is not separated from Peter. Since it comes from Peter, we read that he is now set to be the foundation stone of the church. Furthermore, Hilary states in another section, "Thus our one immovable foundation, our one blissful rock of faith, is a confession from Peter's mouth." We are clear that a separation of Peter's confession from Peter himself is illogical, as Hilary has already clearly stated that Peter is the rock foundation of the church. He says, he took up Peter, to whom he had just before given the keys of the kingdom of heaven, upon whom he was about to build the church. He says, Peter, the first confessor of the Son of God, the foundation of the church. St. Ambrose. How can St. Ambrose be misunderstood when Ambrose says, how could he not confirm his faith in reference to Peter's faith? But never does he say that the faith and the faith alone are the rock. In fact, he doesn't even hint at that. Ambrose says in this very same passage, in totality, he says that I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. But to that same Peter, when he had said on an earlier occasion, "You are Christ, Son of the living God," he answered, "You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and I will give to you the keys of the kingdom of heaven." After and only after saying this does Ambrose say, how could he not confirm his faith, unto whom of his own authority he gave the kingdom, and whom when he styles a rock, he pointed out the foundation of the church. Ambrose is clear when he says, Peter is called the rock, because like an immovable rock he sustains the joints and the mass of an entire Christian edifice. We hear that Augustine would later on go to retract his belief that Peter was the rock, but this is illogical. Augustine never abandons Peter being the rock. And what's more, his work Retractationis does not mean that he is retracting previously held beliefs. Augustine explains that Peter is the rock of the church, and that either interpretation as Peter as rock or Christ as rock is a viable choice for the reader. He leaves it up to the reader. This is a later interpretation, but he never changes his view that Peter was the rock, ever, but rather advances a new one. St. Gregory the Great says, who could be ignorant of the fact that the Holy Church is consolidated in the solidity of the Prince of the Apostles, whose firmness of character extended to his name, so that he should be called Peter after the rock? How can you misunderstand and believe Gregory does not think Peter is a rock in Matthew 16? It is ridiculous. He says numerous times, the care of the whole church was committed to Holy Peter, the Prince of the Apostles. For to him it is said, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. This Orthodox individual goes on and says that where there are many other quotes, he doesn't have enough space to present them. We'll cover in detail a few of the other fathers that were listed. Jerome. We read a certain quote from Jerome, in which we clearly see that he believed the church's foundation was apostolic. He even says it was apostolic. He says that one among the 12 was chosen, so that when a head is appointed, there should be no occasion for schism. Jerome viewed Peter as the head of the church, but what interests us is his interpretation of Matthew 16, and whether it was a Petrine one. And indeed he says, thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. As he bestowed light on his apostles so that they were to be called light of the world, as they obtained other titles from the Lord, so also to Simon, who believed in the rock Christ, was given the name Peter, rock. And in accordance with the metaphor of a rock, it is justly said to him, I will build my church upon you. And there are numerous other instances in Jerome where he identifies Peter as the rock. Furthermore, moving onwards, we hear a quote that is attributed to Hilary of Poitiers. The quote is put down as saying, I believe that by the rock you must understand the unshaken faith of the apostles. Well, we are also told this appears in Hilary's second book of the Trinity. But this doesn't appear in Hilary's second book of the Trinity, or in any book of the Trinity, or in any section of the second book of the Trinity in Hilary. It just isn't there. And if this individual had done research, he would have been able to catch that. Moving on and dealing with what he says about Cyril of Alexandria, the relevant quotation is put forth that says, the word rock has only a denominative value. It signifies nothing but the steadfast and firm faith of the apostles. What is interesting is that this quote does not read this way. It reads, the word rock has only a denominative value. It signifies nothing but the steadfast and firm faith of the apostle. Singular, not plural. We must recall that if the argument being put forth is that Peter and his confession of faith are to be separated from the man himself, then we have a theological novelty on our hands. Moving on to Origen. What does Origen say about Matthew 16? He says, Peter, that great foundation of the church and most solid rock upon which Christ founded the church. Upon him, as on the earth, the church was founded. Peter, a truly blessed rock in which we too are placed, he says. We have no interest in delving into what the fathers said on various other topics. This video and this examination is to be on the fathers and the rock of Matthew 16, so we'll be sticking to this topic rather than veering off in other directions as this Orthodox layperson does. And in closing this video, we are asked to name one Greek father within the first 6 centuries that connected the Bishop of Rome with the promise of Peter. And the question is worded in a way as to imply that none of the fathers, particularly Greek speakers, tied apostolic succession into Christ's promise to Peter. We will cover this in short detail, and in fact, we've got to point out that this is untrue, and we find this evinced in St. Athanasius and St. Irenaeus, and you will see the relevant portions appearing on the screen in just a moment. And it is quite significant when we examine into great detail everything that is being put forth here, and we realize that this individual not only has not done his research, he's not studied this in depth, and he really does not know what he's talking about. We can only hope that this will help other individuals that have questions about the papacy and what the fathers thought about this topic. God bless.